Inspector Nira Veylan was celebrated as the fearless face of justice, but behind her shining reputation lay a secret tied to her sister, Elora Veylan. Businessman Ronan Dresh lived like he was untouchable, while Detective Marek Hollis began to notice cracks in the perfect image. And in the center of it all was Selene Kaith, a young woman whose disappearance would expose the most shocking truth the town had ever seen. Selene Kaith's disappearance unsettled the entire town in ways no one had expected. She was young, energetic, and known by nearly everyone because of her friendly nature and constant presence at community gatherings. On the evening she went missing, she had been seen leaving her friend's apartment around 9 o'clock, walking along a dimly lit road that cut between suburban houses and a small row of shops. That was the last confirmed sighting. Hours later, her phone was discovered on the pavement near an abandoned corner, its screen cracked, the battery drained, and no trace of her anywhere. The chilling detail that disturbed investigators the most was the way the phone was left out in the open, as if deliberately placed there to be found. When Inspector Nira Veylan stepped onto the scene, the crowd of anxious neighbors seemed to calm instantly. Nira had built her career on efficiency and fearlessness, known as the kind of officer who never hesitated to confront danger head-on. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, noting the faint tire marks on the dusty roadside, the scattered cigarette butts, and the unusual silence of the neighborhood. Despite the police activity, she ordered the area to be sealed, and evidence collectors moved in. On the surface, it seemed like a routine missing person investigation, yet those who observed her closely noticed a hesitation in her movements, as if something about the case unsettled her more than usual. The search widened quickly. Posters of Selene's face appeared on streetlights, community volunteers combed through nearby parks and woods, and police patrols worked day and night to retrace her last steps. Interviews with residents brought little progress. Some recalled seeing her walking alone. Others claimed they heard a car door slam around the same time, but no one had seen the actual moment she vanished. The case gained traction on local news channels, fueling fear that a predator was roaming the street. Parents refused to let their children walk alone, and the once safe neighborhood felt tainted by dread. Behind the scenes, tension was brewing within the police department. Nira's reputation meant that every officer looked to her for leadership, but she seemed unusually cautious in her decision. When a witness came forward claiming to have seen Selene arguing with a man in a black vehicle, Nira downplayed the account, labeling it as unreliable. When another report suggested a suspicious figure loitering near the shops that night, she quietly dismissed it. Some of her subordinates wondered if she was trying to protect the integrity of the case, but others began to whisper that she was holding back for reasons unknown. Selene's family was devastated. Her mother sat outside the station every morning, clutching her daughter's photo, begging for updates. Her father organized search teams that wandered farther out each day, scouring riversides, abandoned lots, and highways. The pressure mounted, and the media began asking hard questions about why no solid leads were emerging. Nira faced reporters with her usual composure, assuring them that the investigation was ongoing, but in private she spent long nights locked in her office, staring at maps and files, without making clear progress. The oddest part of the case was how quickly suspicion settled on Ronan Dresh, a businessman already known for shady dealings. Several townspeople mentioned seeing him in the area that night, his luxury car standing out against the modest surrounding. Rumors suggested that Selene had been seen with him before, though no one could provide concrete proof. Despite the growing noise around Ronan's name, Nira hesitated to bring him in for questioning. Her silence on the matter puzzled even her closest colleagues. As days turned into weeks, the town's unease deepened. Candlelight vigils were held in Selene's memory, even though hope still lingered that she might be found alive. For Nira, each vigil was a silent reminder of her duty, but also a weight she seemed unable to bear fully. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition whenever Ronan's name surfaced, a brief tightening of her jaw when questioned about her strategy. To the public, she remained the fearless protector of the community. But in the shadows of the investigation, the seeds of doubt were beginning to grow. The disappearance of Selene Kaith was no longer just a mystery about a missing woman. It was slowly becoming a mirror reflecting the hidden cracks in the life of the town's most trusted police officer, cracks that would only deepen as the truth crept closer. All suspicions that once floated quietly around town now began circling one man, Ronan Dresh. He was no stranger to the police. His name had been whispered in connection with illegal deals, money laundering and even trafficking, but nothing had ever stuck. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable, moving around with a sleek black car and dressed in suits that seemed out of place in the modest town. When Selene's disappearance dominated the headlines, it was only a matter of time before people began linking her case to Ronan's dark reputation. The fact that he had been seen near the street where she vanished was enough to ignite gossip, and soon his name became the center of every conversation. For Inspector Nira Veylan, the suspicion on Ronan was more than just an investigative lead. It was a looming shadow she couldn't ignore. Yet her actions seemed strangely careful. She reviewed the reports, studied the maps and checked the statements, but whenever evidence pointed in Ronan's direction, she slowed down, as if measuring every move with deliberate hesitation. Her subordinates noticed it too. Normally, Nira was aggressive in chasing leads, but now she was filing them aside, marking them as pending verification. Within the department, officers began whispering behind closed doors. Why was she shielding a man like Ronan, a figure despised by almost everyone? The public began noticing as well. When reporters questioned why Ronan hadn't been called in for questioning, Nira's responses were vague. She insisted that the department could not act on speculation, that facts needed to be verified, and that premature arrests could damage the case. Her words sounded convincing enough on television, but in living rooms across the town, people exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Ronan's history, and they knew Nira's reputation for bravery. Something didn't add up. Meanwhile, Ronan continued to live openly and without fear. Days after Selene's disappearance, he was seen dining at an upscale restaurant, laughing with business partners, sipping expensive wine, and moving with the confidence of someone who believed himself immune to consequence. This display of arrogance only fueled the anger of Selene's family. Her father publicly demanded that police take action, his voice breaking with grief as he held up his daughter's photo. The community rallied behind him, holding protests outside Ronan's business offices, chanting for justice, waving banners with Selene's face, and calling for accountability. Yet despite the public pressure, Nira's stance remained unchanged. Behind the walls of the precinct, Detective Marek Hollis was watching carefully. He was junior to Nira but had a sharp instinct for spotting inconsistencies. Marek had been quietly keeping track of the gaps in her report. He noticed how timelines were vague, how certain statements from witnesses mysteriously went missing from official files, and how photographs that should have been evidence were locked away under restricted tags. He grew suspicious, not only of Ronan, but of the very person leading the case. Something about Nira's reluctance felt personal. The town itself seemed to transform as suspicion thickened. Restaurants whispered with hushed conversations. Neighbors glanced over shoulders when Ronan's car drove past, and Selene's case became a dividing line between those who believed justice was near and those who believed the system was compromised. Fear crept into the streets, not just from the idea that a young woman had vanished, but from the unsettling realization that the very person sworn to protect them might not be as straightforward as they thought. What made the situation even stranger was the link between Ronan and Nira's younger sister, Elora. While the connection was not yet public, fragments of gossip had begun to circulate. Ronan was often seen near places Elora visited, and whispers suggested that they were more than casual acquaintances. Nira, of course, said nothing, but her silence in the face of growing evidence against Ronan only made those rumors louder. It was as if the missing woman's case was pulling apart the layers of the police officer's carefully built image, exposing secrets she could no longer fully control. By the end of the second week, the entire community had shifted its focus away from the victim and onto the strange dynamic between Nira and Ronan. Was the officer protecting him out of fear, loyalty, or something deeper? The truth was still buried, but every day that passed without progress in Selene's case only fueled the town's suspicion. Ronan thrived in the chaos, smirking at the cameras, living his life as if nothing had happened. And Nira, once celebrated as the fearless protector of justice, stood at the edge of a dangerous cliff, her silence threatening to destroy not only her career, but the fragile trust of an entire town. Detective Marek Hollis was not the type to let details slip through unnoticed. As the days dragged on and Selene Kaith's disappearance showed no real progress, he grew more and more uneasy about the way Inspector Nira Veylan was handling the case. Her reputation had always been one of precision and courage, yet here she was, allowing crucial evidence to be shelved and obvious leads to be ignored. For Marek, the inconsistencies became too frequent to dismiss as simple mistakes. He began to quietly collect his own set of notes, keeping a parallel record of the investigation that mirrored, but did not entirely match, the official one. In those pages, the cracks in Nira's image were becoming sharper with every passing day. One of the first things that stood out to Marek was the timeline. Witnesses had reported seeing Selene near the row of shops, shortly before she disappeared. Yet Nira's official report listed her last known location as a different street, one that conveniently removed Ronan Dresh from the picture. When Marek double-checked the interviews, he found the original witness statements, but they were filed in a way that ensured no one else would stumble upon them. Even stranger, the photographs of the black car reportedly seen near Selene had been marked as unclear and filed away as irrelevant, though Marek could clearly make out the vehicle's shape in the blurry image. The inconsistencies didn't stop there. A shopkeeper had claimed that he saw Selene arguing with someone near the road. He had even mentioned recognizing the man's voice, though he couldn't see the face clearly. That testimony never appeared in the official report. Instead, it was buried deep in supplemental files that only someone actively searching would ever find. Marek knew then that this wasn't just sloppy work. Someone was deliberately removing Ronan's presence from the narrative, and all evidence pointed toward Nira being the one responsible. Marek's suspicion deepened when he started hearing rumors about Nira's younger sister, Elora Veylan. Elora was not a public figure, but she had been spotted in places Ronan frequented, sometimes late at night, sometimes during gatherings that carried an air of exclusivity. People whispered about their closeness, and though nothing had been proven, it raised a troubling possibility. Nira wasn't just protecting Ronan because of professional hesitation. She might have a personal reason. If Ronan had ties to her sister, then the entire foundation of her investigation was compromised. Still, Marek knew better than to confront her directly. Nira's status in the department meant that any accusation without proof would end his career instantly. So he kept watching, waiting, documenting every discrepancy, every quiet dismissal of evidence. He noticed how Nira's demeanor changed whenever Ronan's name was mentioned. Her shoulders stiffened, her answers became curt, and her eyes avoided direct contact. It was a small but telling sign, the kind of behavior that betrayed internal conflict. Meanwhile, Selene's family remained relentless in their pursuit of answers. Marek found himself sympathizing with them more than ever, especially as he realized the truth might already be within reach, but deliberately hidden. Each time he saw Selene's mother sitting outside the station, with her daughter's picture, Marek's determination hardened. He could no longer accept the idea that justice was being delayed because of loyalty or fear. The more Marek dug, the more dangerous his position became. He started noticing cars trailing him at night, shadows that seemed to linger too long, and phone calls that ended as soon as he answered. Ronan's influence stretched far, and Marek understood that prying too deeply could put him at risk. Yet the thought of leaving the case unresolved was worse. He realized he was standing against not just a criminal but also the very officer who should have been leading the fight for truth. By now, Marek was convinced that Nira was concealing something monumental, something that tied Ronan directly to Selene's disappearance. Whether it was out of protection for her sister, fear of exposure, or a deeper alliance, he couldn't yet tell, but the pattern was undeniable. Every thread of evidence that pointed to Ronan was being clipped, redirected, or erased under Nira's command. It was as though the town's symbol of justice was working against justice itself. Marek's private notes ended with a single chilling line written late one night. "This is no longer about finding Selene. This is about finding out how deep Nira Veylan's secrets go." The case had shifted from a simple missing person investigation into something far darker, a collision between truth and deception, loyalty and justice. The cracks in the officer's perfect image were spreading, and Marek knew it was only a matter of time before the entire facade collapsed. Elora Veylan had always lived in the shadow of her older sister, Inspector Nira Veylan, where Nira was disciplined, admired, and known for her rigid sense of duty. Elora was restless, drawn to risk and excitement. Few in the town even knew much about her, and she preferred it that way. But her carefully guarded private life was beginning to unravel, and with it the carefully constructed image of her sister. The truth that emerged about Elora explained why Nira's actions in the investigation had seemed so conflicted and why the case had become dangerously entangled with personal loyalties. Elora had met Ronan Dresh months before Selene's disappearance. At first it was through chance encounters at social gatherings, but Ronan's charm and wealth quickly pulled her into his orbit. He showered her with gifts, introduced her to glamorous circles she had never imagined entering, and convinced her that being by his side meant power and security. For someone who had lived in the shadow of a perfect sister, Ronan's attention felt intoxicating. But what Elora could not see at the beginning was how tightly his world was bound to crime. By the time she realized it, she was already in too deep. The connection between Ronan and Elora was the hidden key to the entire case. Selene Kaith had crossed paths with Ronan when she stumbled upon one of his dealings. She had not been part of his world, but she became a liability simply by knowing too much. Elora was present when Selene was lured into a meeting under the pretense of a job opportunity. She remembered the unease in Selene's eyes and the way Ronan brushed it off with his confident smile. That night, something went wrong. Selene resisted, tried to escape, and Ronan lost control. Elora did not act, frozen by fear, and by the time she realized the severity of what had happened, Selene was gone. Haunted by guilt, Elora carried the weight of that secret, while Nira unknowingly began investigating the disappearance. But it didn't take long for Nira to notice the truth. Subtle signs in her sister's behavior, unexplained absences, and the sudden presence of expensive gifts revealed enough for her to piece it together. For Nira, the realization was shattering. Her role as an officer demanded that she bring criminals like Ronan to justice, but her loyalty as a sister demanded that she protect Elora at all costs. It was this conflict that explained her hesitation, her reluctance to pursue Ronan, and her careful silencing of evidence that would have exposed the connection. Detective Marek Hollis, however, was relentless. Through his quiet investigation, he eventually crossed paths with Elora himself. She was breaking under the pressure of silence, struggling with the double life she was living. When Marek cornered her with questions she could no longer avoid, the truth spilled out. She admitted to knowing Ronan intimately, confessed her presence during Selene's last night, and revealed the horrifying details of how Nira had shielded her by suppressing evidence. The revelation was devastating. For Marek, it was confirmation of his worst suspicions, but it also raised the stakes beyond anything he expected. This was no longer just about Selene's disappearance or Ronan's crimes. It was about corruption within the heart of the investigation itself. For the town, which still believed Nira to be their unwavering defender, the truth would be unthinkable. If Elora's confession reached the public, it would destroy the trust they had placed in the police and in the woman they considered untouchable. Elora herself was torn apart by guilt. She had once believed that Ronan offered her an escape from her ordinary life, but now she saw him as the destroyer of everything. Her silence had allowed Selene's family to suffer without answers, and her dependence on Nira had turned her sister into a conspirator. As she confessed to Marek, her tears revealed not just fear of Ronan, but shame at how her choices had pulled her family into darkness. Nira, on the other hand, faced the greatest crisis of her life. When she discovered that Elora had spoken to Marek, she realized the fragile balance she had been maintaining was collapsing. The truth she had buried was clawing its way into the open, and with it, her career and reputation. She could no longer protect both her sister and her badge. The case had become personal in a way no one else could fully understand, and the line between justice and betrayal was vanishing before her eyes. The missing girl's tragedy was now inseparable from the story of two sisters bound by love, guilt, and devastating choices. The case had started as a search for Selene Kaith, but had evolved into a test of how far one woman would go to protect her family, even if it meant dismantling the very principles she had sworn to uphold. The discovery came on a cold morning when officers searching the outskirts of town stumbled upon an abandoned property once owned by Ronan Dresh. Overgrown grass hid the edges of the land, and the windows of the crumbling house were boarded up. Behind the building,
In a shallow patch of disturbed soil, searchers found what everyone had feared: Selene Kaith's body. The news shattered the last thread of hope clung to by her family and ignited a storm of outrage across the community. The girl who had once been the symbol of innocence and kindness was now a victim whose final resting place lay on property connected directly to the most feared man in town. For investigators, the discovery was confirmation that Ronan had been at the center of the case all along. For Inspector Nira Veylan, it was the end of her fragile web of silence. The evidence surrounding the burial site left little room for doubt. Tire marks matched Ronan's car, fibers from his clothing were found near the shallow grave, and the soil showed signs of hurried digging, as if the act had been carried out in panic. More chilling, however, was the discovery of items that linked back not just to Ronan, but to Nira herself. A torn piece of fabric from a police-issued jacket was recovered near the site, one that matched the uniforms of her department. Forensic testing would later prove that it belonged to Nira's own set of gear, a detail that tied her directly to the cover-up. As word spread, the town erupted. Crowds gathered outside the police station demanding answers. Reporters filled the airwaves with headlines accusing the police of corruption. Selene's parents, now crushed by grief, publicly called for accountability from those who had not only failed to protect their daughter, but had also betrayed justice itself. The once unshakable faith the community had in Nira Veylan collapsed overnight. She was no longer the admired figure who had stood as a pillar of protection, but the officer accused of shielding a killer. Elora's role in unraveling the truth could no longer remain hidden. When she was brought in for questioning under the watch of Detective Marek Hollis, she admitted her connection with Ronan, recounting in painful detail how she had stood by while Selene was drawn into his trap. Her confession painted the full picture of the night of the crime, how Ronan had lured Selene under the pretense of opportunity, how an argument turned violent, and how Elora's fear silenced her when she could have intervened. Most damning of all was her admission that Nira had found out almost immediately and, instead of bringing Ronan in, chose to bury evidence to protect her sister. The courtroom became the stage for one of the most scandalous trials the town had ever seen. Ronan Dresh, dressed in his signature arrogance, faced charges of abduction and murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and even his wealth and influence could not buy his way out this time. He was convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. But the real shock came when proceedings turned toward Nira. With Elora's testimony and the physical evidence tying her to the cover-up, she faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The town that had once cheered her name now watched as she stood in the defendant's box, her face stripped of its usual strength. For Nira, the trial was not just a battle against the law but against the image she had built for years. Every achievement, every act of bravery, every headline praising her fearlessness, now meant nothing in the face of betrayal. Her silence, born out of love for her sister, had destroyed her career and shattered the community's trust. Elora, overwhelmed by guilt, told the court that her sister's actions were the only reason Ronan's crime had not been exposed sooner. She admitted that Nira had tried to protect her from ruin, but in doing so had allowed a murderer to remain free for weeks. When the verdict was finally read, Ronan was led away in chains, and Nira was handed her sentence. Though less severe than Ronan's, it carried the weight of disgrace. She would serve time, but the greater punishment was the collapse of everything she had once stood for. The community turned its back on her. The badge she had once worn with pride was stripped away, and her name became a cautionary tale whispered in the same breath as betrayal. The truth about the lady police officer was no longer hid. She had not been the fearless savior everyone believed in, but a flawed human being whose love for family had blinded her to justice. The story of Selene Kaith's murder became more than just a tragedy. It became a lesson in how even the strongest guardians could fall when secrets and loyalty outweighed truth. The town moved on with scars that would never fully heal, forever remembering the moment when the protector became the deceiver, and justice only arrived after trust had already been destroyed.